Chapter 10. Cameron's resolving moment with Mr. Tiberias. A decisive meeting of the minds. It happened again on a night in early August, perhaps one of the hottest, stuffiest nights of the year. After some struggle to find peace of mind and any semblance of comfort in his airless, stiflingly boiling hot room, Cameron managed to finally slip into a deep sleep that agreed with his mind and body, and it seemed that he might get some rest after all. He had been reporting back to work as per usual, and these strange dreams appeared to be at a kind of standstill. For several weeks he had not heard a shred of Mr. Tiberias's voice, or even an echo of his peculiar verbiage, and he began to think less of the whole ordeal. Life, as he knew it, appeared to be easing back into a state of normalcy. It was odd at first, without the influence of the eye creature perfidiously and slyly making its way into his life, and Cameron began to suspect that even his absence was some kind of a mind game that was being played, possibly not in his favor. However, after some time spent adjusting, he began to gradually become acclimated to the real world again. He still met with Cecil on good terms, and the rapport was growing into something wonderful, but there was something slightly lacking in the relationship. This wasn't noticeable at first, but perhaps the lack of Mr. Tiberias made Cameron less able to assert himself and be as upfront and honest as he had been. It was a peculiar feeling. He actually began to miss that in some ways. Yet, at this point, his patience for Mr. Tiberias's antics had begun to wane, and he figured he would get on just fine without him. He continued work at the office as well, and the new decisions and attitudes he adopted to carry on with him persisted. True, he surmised that it would be best for him not to confront Mr. Singer or Robin with the same caliber of intensity as he had previously. He felt that he had made an unquestionable impression, and already did that. If he went any further, he might lose his job. Instead, he carried on with a newly acquired state of assertiveness, but did not wield it thoughtlessly. Yet, it felt as if something were lacking here too. It was like something about him, and the way he carried himself, was left undealt with. There was something that was in dire need of a conclusion that had been left unfinished. This was a very unsettling feeling. It felt like there was a pertinent door that needed to be closed, or an avenue of his spirit left unimpeded, and he needed to attend to it. On that night, he felt the pangs of an ominous, lurid nightmare take over his soul. His mind tried to hold on to what he knew to be real, but reality only slipped out of his grasp more quickly than ever before. Objects seemed to appear and disappear with no pattern or recognizable interval. His alarm clock floated off his desk and veered toward him, along with a cup, book, and several other vaguely material items in his room. He grabbed the clock, which sported fierce teeth, and bit him. The pain was so real and immediate that he almost jolted out of his sleep, but was quickly lulled back into his dreams by the sudden rush of cool waves that looked to be crashing outside his window. Suddenly, he felt the shadows of an indiscernible, slender, winged shape with what looked to be a large beak or proboscis obtruding starkly. And sure enough, the figure of two bird-like creatures soared elegantly down from the trees and entered through Cameron's window. They landed on the floor, making not even the slightest thud, retracted their wings smoothly. They stood there, just several paces from him, and a luminous effulgence radiated around them. They had majestic feathered wings that were a stark scarlet red, like a phoenix's, and they had a glowing mass of energy that looked almost akin to a ball of lightning in the center of their torsos. Unlike most birds, or ornitherae in general, they walked upright and had legs very much like mammal, such as a bear or deer, as well as large tails which resemble that of a tiger's. Their heads resembled those of birds, specifically a raven, or perhaps a falcon, similar to that of the Egyptian god Horus, and their immense wings folded into a withdrawn shape which lay by their sides. Underneath their wings, shrouded almost out of sight, were two talons that were tucked underneath. They approached Cameron slowly, with such nimble ease that he didn't feel threatened. They exuded a kind of otherworldly warmth, and had a peaceful, serene way about them. As they drew nearer to Cameron, they stretched out their wings and enveloped him, and grasping him with their talons, which felt surprisingly gentle, and there were no abrasions as they took hold of him, extending their unconquerable wings to their full range and thrusting themselves off the ground before lunging out of the window. Cameron's heart stopped momentarily, and he shuddered fearfully when they lunged downward, but relief took over as they flew majestically upward with tenacity and confidence at the last second. It was a very odd feeling. He felt both endangered but protected in these creatures' hands, and he didn't know which feeling was more trustworthy. They flew for what felt like hours, but time seemed to be speeding up as daylight was encroaching upon them. The sun appeared not as a large star in the sky, but as two different spheres, one bright yellow and the other pitch black. They covered opposite sides of the horizon, but passed each other in a kind of partial eclipse. When the shadier sphere came closer, nothing but darkness followed it and cloaked the lands in shadows. When the lighter one passed over, it brought with it endless light, almost to the point of blindness. Cameron had to shield his eyes from it. The two creatures held him with a sturdy grip and brought him past many spectacles. They flew over a tropical, jungle-covered land, covered in smoke. From the center he could barely make out the remnants of a fire engulfing the forests and villages of this poor island. He could also faintly make out figures of what appeared to be people flocking round any possible safe haven, of which there weren't many. They rushed around madly in circles, trying to escape, but there was no use. The fire had begun to eat up the last available sanctuary, which was a stone fortress on top of a peak in a valley, which they seemed to fare well against at first, but was soon in flames. Cameron shouted for help and pointed to the island, which they already passed. "Look, they need help. They're dying. Why won't you stop?" Cameron belted out at the top of his lungs and insisted they look, but the two winged creatures only looked straight ahead, with intense, imperturbable focus. They only stole a glance at Cameron, but did not listen. With one last opportunity, Cameron looked behind him and could just see the inhabitants of this island jumping from the docks of the harbor into the ocean and drowning. It was a dismal, horrific sight, and he dared not to look longer than he had to. Following this, the two creatures flew onward toward another island, which was a sizable, flat land, pocked with countless skies. The landscape looked to be a frozen tundra, with several glaciers covering it. This island was quite different to the cloistered tropical one which had been brutally set aflame. It had a formidable chill and a desolate nature to it. The wide, open expanse of ice, minor shrubs, and little to no trees struck Cameron as a sorry, sorry place to be, unless, of course, one had some kind of community or warm place to stay. Yet, it looked as if there was not one soul within a 100-mile radius. However, Cameron did spot one tiny, almost imperceptible little, rusty, boarded-up cottage tucked away in the icy grass of the lands, with icebergs visible off the coast. He saw one vague figure of what looked to be a person in the midst of walking from that cottage to the sea, but he could hardly see what they looked like, as they were unrecognizable, and from such a distance they continued slowly on a tiny dirt road that led to a jetty. There were no ships or any kind of perceivable signs of civilization, which struck Cameron as unsettling. He felt oddly sorry for the person. Who were they? Were they the only person cursed to live alone on this god-forsaken island with no contact with the external world? Could this person be some kind of cruel experiment? Were they some kind of guardian over this barren, isolated area? Had this elusive stranger's plight not resembled Mr. Tiberias's, and could it in fact be the eye creature himself? He had so many questions, but it was too late to bother venturing into them, as they passed by it rapidly and moved on. After floating above a considerable expanse of ocean for some time, they finally reached land, and Cameron could make out the tops of the mountains beginning to make themselves visible amid pearlescent clouds. Finally, when they reached land, Cameron saw before him a great sandy desert, but not one that was swelteringly hot and unwelcoming. It was surprisingly cool, with a welcoming breeze along with a bountiful river that flowed beside a row of adobe huts comprising a peaceful little village. He could not make out the people walking through this village, but the winged creatures took him closer to the central apex of the village, where a mammoth acropolis stood, much like a Greek academy or temple. Though the rest of the town appeared to be empty, he saw droves of figures flocking to this acropolis, where there stood a semicircle of mammoth stone relics with inscriptions on them. Though Cameron could not read them, once he looked at them, he intuitively felt the words appear within his mind with stunning clarity. Woe to those who claim that they know, wicked and vile, corrupt with bile. These men are ignorant fools who know not truth. Cursed be the womb that bore you. There was one symbol that Cameron could make out, which was an unmistakable, enormous eyeball that was the center of the monolithic stone, etched in simplistic yet obvious manner. All the people wore veils on their faces and gradually marched around the semicircle in a trance-like state. There was one figure in the center of them, some kind of high priest who chanted incantations. These were entirely in an unknown language, which almost sounded Cornish or Celtic, with minacious, strong hums. He didn't dare draw attention to himself and clung to the creatures that brought him there, but he was still not entirely certain whether these visions were a product of his own manifestations of dream reality or a part of Mr. Tiberias's crafty schemes. When one is in a dream, often not aware of the manner in which time, events, logic, or the closest approximation you can get, unfold, they are all suspended in a kind of dream logic, a nebulous, bilious world of psychologically hectic fervor that even the most determined, rational minds couldn't cure. It was this state that Cameron felt himself dragged into helplessly. He had absolutely no idea where he was going. It was similar to being cast into a deep ocean in which he sank to the bottom and was awash in a riptide of horrendous imagination, and there was no anchorage point. Finally, he felt a sudden wave of clarity wash over him. The veiled men extolled in their books and began chanting along with the priest. Promptly, they lit a fire and set ablaze a series of those same books and watched them incinerate. Partway through this strange ritual, the two creatures set Cameron down on a hill from which he could fully observe the sights before him. He gazed in the direction of a little hamlet of adobe brick buildings again. It was directly behind him on top of a steep, rocky hill. It appeared to be somewhat similar in structure to most villages, with a town center of some kind and a public building in the epicenter of the streets. Though the street was made of dirt, it had a fairly clean and smooth look. There was hardly any vegetation, save for the few shrubs and bushes that flanked the public square. Why the residents didn't choose to have the ritual in the town square confused Cameron. However, it became apparent that something was going awry when abruptly the sky became darkly lit. A foreboding shadow was cast over the whole island, and thunder rumbled loudly in a fateful roar. The crowd of people suddenly became hectic and danced around madly. Some seemed to be doing it out of fear, others out of a vague confusion. But one thing was clear. The ritual had ended. The high priest didn't bother ending his monologue and latched onto a nearby rock for support as the thunder and lightning continued to strike. Then, out of nowhere, the cacophony of shouting and thunder waned, and the clouds parted as the light returned. The droves of people had addled expressions. It looked as if they were ashamed of themselves for whatever they had been doing and wanted to hide, but they couldn't find a point of refuge in the ritual altar, so they fled back to the adobe houses. Within only a few minutes, they dashed madly down the hill, across a stone bridge connecting a small river, and bolted into their homes. But it was no use. Out of the same clouds of a ferocious volley of fireballs that looked to be meteors, they struck the little hamlet and rapidly set it on fire. In a swift wave of destruction, the flames devoured the houses within minutes, and the whole village was reduced to a wretched pile of ashes. Cameron was astounded. The sight made him even more ill at ease than the vision of the island in flames. It must have been because he was so close and intimately cognizant of what was transpiring around him. The two winged creatures lifted him off the ground and held him above the acrid smoke and flames below. He could distinctly sense the angry warmth of the flames on his skin as they flew to safety. The two creatures flew him to another portion of the island where there was a large, extensive green field of wheat that stretched for miles on end. The creatures released their grip and let Cameron wander as he pleased. There were a few trees speckling this landscape, and at certain points it looked as if clouds of the sky met with the ground so that there was no barrier between the two, like a deep vastness of oceanic proportions which became more and more hazy, majestic blue, and gray as he got closer. There was one light behind this vast array of cloudy forms. It scattered in almost an endless, repeatedly unique pattern across the sky. From a distance, he saw a vague figure of some kind of elk or caribou that hopped through the mist. He felt a sudden urge to follow its path and wound up chasing it through the valleys, fields, and gorges. He felt himself abruptly transmuted into a rabbit that leapt at a rapid pace. After leaping for some time, he suddenly sensed the earth beneath him rumble and quake slightly. Then all the ground around him shattered, and he fell into a large smog-shrouded void where there was no ground left, and he fell helplessly below. What happened next was exceedingly hard to recall for Cameron. Immediately after falling into that massive depth, he lost control over his being and fell back into a kind of sleep or lull. He felt himself back in his human form, but awoke in a dark, damp, oily cave where he lay feebly. The cavernous area around him was moist and confining, and there were stalagmites on the ceiling that were dripping on him. He noticed that when he had thought about something, it appeared in longhand form, as if it were etched in ink on the wall before him, and it sounded like it was an amplified version of his voice, uttered the words he spoke in a loud volume that echoed throughout the cave. The more he thought, the louder it reiterated around him. He covered his ears against the noise, but it was no use. There was no feasible way of bringing his inner monologue to a halt. Out of nowhere, a diabolical laugh emerged from deep within the cave, and he heard the audible sound of light footsteps approaching progressively closer. It wasn't that maniacal snicker that made Cameron fearful, but the ever-growing noise of the footsteps, which became increasingly louder, but never seemed to get closer. It was jarring and disquieting to be placed in such a horrendous, cramped little place. He could think of no reason why Mr. Tiberias, his own mind, or even his subconscious ego, in his most baffling form, would take him there. He had been in comfortably astonishing, tranquil, albeit strange land only minutes earlier. How could it have turned so violently frightening? As he looked at the wall, he saw writing suddenly appear again, but it wasn't his own thoughts, or at least as far as he could tell, and it seemed to be warning him of something to come. It said, in large, embossed, engraved writing, "Be of good cheer when we are near. No need to fear. Your inescapable doom is sure to loom. Do not be downcast. Happiness is also sure to last." This message resounded with extraordinary dread for Cameron. At this point, the source of the strange laughter emerged from the far end of the cave, revealing itself to be Mr. Tiberias, who was clothed not in his usual high-class garb, but a luxurious robe which looked similar to a Greek chiton. He was eclipsed by a powerful light behind him to such an extent that it was difficult to make him out, but his unmistakable giant eye was flashing. It wasn't long before he made his typical hospitable salutation. "Ah, you were patient enough to wait for me now, my friend. I apologize for the dismal setting. I did implore them to keep us on the island where we could converse more leniently, but due to the little distended, turgid flow of events, I'm afraid that won't be possible. I myself hate cavernous areas as much as I'm sure you do. My physiology was made for the studying room. My eye was made for scrutiny, not for damp, distasteful hollows," Mr. Tiberias said this genially, as though he were attempting to offer a sincere explanation, but it still came off as somewhat derisive, especially given his appearance, which Cameron thought as both unsettling and effete at the same time. Partway through speaking, he withdrew a tiny, compact box of matches, struck one of them, and lit his pipe, which had been tucked under the girded strap of his tunic. "I don't understand," Cameron started in a state of disarray, shielding his eyes from the light. "I can't tell what is real anymore, but none of this feels fake. You showed up in my life, which is completely unacceptable. You can show up in my dreams. That's fine. I can just wake up and brush it off as meaningless nonsense. It doesn't make a difference. I know for a fact that you're not real. It doesn't matter what I feel to be there or not. That's not the point. The fact is that though you may seem real, perhaps more real than the good majority of false things in my world, you are not who you appear to be. There's a thin mask over that ever-darting eye of yours that's slipping. I may not be able to articulate what it is that is off about you, but there is definitely just something off about you. I just know it in ways I can't explain." Cameron's mood transitioned into pure, restless, unresolved agitation as he paced back and forth aimlessly, trying to find a way out of the fuliginous cave, whose walls seemed to shift ever so slightly as he did so. "Is that what the good Dr. Barlow told you? That I'm a product of your repressed imagination? That I am merely a ghost in the machine-like Cartesian mind of yours? That I am a foul phantom of unrealized, ghastly potential? That I am a miasmic approximation of all your most suppressed, both fallowed and unsown seeds of probability that you so fear to the point of mania? I see that you've been brushing up on your demonology. How flattering. Tell me, Cameron, which one of those antediluvian, innocuous little demons am I? Abaddon? Abraxas? I've always thought my temperament to be more akin to Abaddon. The demon of the great abyss. So fitting. I may be crafty, but I am no fool. I'll guard these fiery gates with a stern resolve." Mr. Tiberias stopped to let Cameron react, to which he began to feel not as frightened as he was in the past, but progressively more bored with Mr. Tiberias's absurd capers. Tiberias noticed Cameron's increasing disinterest and decided to switch tactics. "Is this still an elaborate joke to you?" retorted Cameron, almost resentfully. "Aren't you aware of the toll that you took on my life? I can't even function normally. Everywhere I go, I see you. When I work, there you are. When I walk home, it's you who's strutting around in my neighborhood. Hell, you probably even approach Cecil. I just know it. That's where I draw the line. You can't just invite yourself into someone's life. It's intrusive, discomforting to say the least. And if you weren't some half-dreamed devil, I'd guarantee you'd be arrested. I don't know what you are or where you came from, but I'm sure any form of law would persecute you without hesitation." Cameron was completely irate and red in the face, slamming his fists against the wall of the cave, not realizing the possible absurdity of his own statements. At this point, he noticed that Mr. Tiberias appeared to be swelling in size, enough that he had to look up at him. "Isn't it wonderful? Both the dream world and the reality are fusing together. The fact of the matter, dear sir, is that once this awkward phase is done, you will not have to worry about trite issues such as normalcy or routine anymore. It's beautiful. Although there will be some difficulties arising because of the hasty, unpredictable nature of the cross-pollination, but once the deed is done, each sphere of reality will reach a kind of equilibrium, and you won't have to worry about these outlandish visions anymore. They will occupy the same space and similar time, and no more inaccuracies and botched evolutions such as Mr. Spencer or Mr. Hollander will haunt us either. You will continue living as normal, but your dream world will be physically manifested along the natural, material one, and they will appear as analogous. By the way, if this new light troubles you, perhaps you should slowly adjust your eyes to it. One can't adjust oneself to any new thought, entity, or phenomena that flows their way, given enough commitment and focus. Additionally, my friend, I did not invite myself into your life as you claim. On the contrary, you invited me. Have you not failed to remember that the contractual document you had signed so glibly? Though it wasn't a black and white piece of paper, it was a very real binding pact that you seemed to gladly enjoy granting my permission to. I apologize for the inconvenience, yet it appears I have suddenly been incommoded with the incipiently surreptitious, now overt workings of the inner gastronomical gases which have chosen a most troublesome opportunity to exhibit their foul mechanisms. Let us continue our little tete-a-tete elsewhere. These bothersome caverns are alarming me, although such caverns are precisely where the likes of the Nag Hammadi were discovered in before being translated to the public. To think that among the likes of dark and dismal caverns these luminous torches of truth were stowed away as if they were shameful vestiges of sin meant to be attenuated and exculpated. Finally, the day came when mankind was not so wrapped up in pride and arrogance that they opened up their minds to the possibility of enlightenment. With the daring of the thrice great Hermes, they took off the blinders and faced reality in the eye. Regardless, I have always had an affinity for the theaters. Let us go, then. With a succinct snap of his thumb and index finger, Mr. Tiberias flashed into nothingness before Cameron's eyes, leaving only a plume of smoke. Cameron's likewise felt himself vanish and reappear into a commodious theater in the round of a style of classical antiquity. The whole auditorium was completely vacant, aside for him and Mr. Tiberias, who appeared on stage and began strutting around exaggeratedly, while a large satin curtain appeared behind him, illuminated by a limelight that accentuated his figure. Accompanying him was loud, almost silly music, like that of a pasquinade, along with the immense blank background. From center stage, Mr. Tiberias gave 3 emphatic bows, and despite there not being a visible audience, disembodied roaring applause resounded throughout the theater. Mr. Tiberias boomed out, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for attending today's theater production. This show has been a great passion of mine that has devoured a good chunk of my life, and I now stand before you confident enough to present to you with my finished work, my obra maestra. Would you please allow me to introduce to you a show, an exhibition of sorts, so comprehensive, encompassing, marvelous, and on such a grand scale that it would rival Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, and it would take even longer to perform. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege of presenting to you a make-believe, a modest treatise on the life and ineradicable death of Cameron D. Town, the most tedious man ever to live." When Mr. Tiberias announced the title, the words manifested themselves by searing on of the fascia of the theater arches, which were braced by robust columns, in blazing, fiery velour. At this point, the invisible audience burst into riotous cheering, which lasted for a few minutes. When it subsided, Mr. Tiberias' flourishing voice arose from the center stage again. "I've taken full artistic license over the poor, meager man's life because he has repeatedly failed to take any precedence over his own. Now I have imbued my own stamp of inventive, poetic expression on this erstwhile timid creature in order to find some light within his soul. So far, I have encountered only a dark void within, one that has harbored a longing for independence but hasn't taken the necessary measures to attain it. He believes that by extending his leash that he has found freedom. He has only restricted his already limited space. What is it that the tragedians, the Aeschyluses, the Euripideans, Sophocleans sought to exemplify? They preached mankind's state as being inextricably linked to suffering and fate. Like when Orestia, Agamemnon, is murdered by Clytemnestra only to be murdered by Orestes. Or in Aeschylus's own demise, when a hard-shelled turtle was dropped on his head by an eagle who unfortunately mistook him for a rock. This is how fate belies us. We are cursed to be its maiden. Or take the sordid fate of Oedipus. He is the very model of a tragic hero. Refined, complicated, guilt-ridden, and with blood on his hands. Or consider Creon of Sophocles' masterwork Antigone, in which our hero is doomed by his own family by forbidding proper funerals for a brother, Polynices. Or Thyestes, king of Olympia, who is exiled by his brother Atreus by their father, Chrysippus, their half-brother, in an attempt to obtain the throne. Ah, the subduction of power. The deterioration of family. That juxtaposition between desire for happiness, bond, and youth being inevitably crushed by the weight of Providence, which sometimes appears as a three-headed serpent tail Cerberus, or other times as the cursed half-man bull Minotaur, pursuing you throughout their hopeless labyrinth in Crete. Think of Shakespeare's Othello, with its bold Moorish general who finds himself an outcast in Cyprus. He falls in love with the young and beautiful Desdemona. Though they love each other dearly, that doesn't prevent jealousy from entering the ranks. His scheming ensign, Iago, perfidiously convinces Othello that Desdemona is cheating on him, and eventually, in a blind rage, he murders her. This is the core of tragedy. Tension, envy, blind prejudice. Othello only finds out she was faithful post hoc in classic Shakespearean fashion, much akin to the unfortunate Romeo and Juliet. There are, of course, the naysayers, who ignorantly proclaim, why can't these characters save themselves the trouble by discussing matters rationally? Why couldn't they simply elucidate on what was going on underneath the surface? But such pedantic inquiries into logic and investigations only kill the heart and soul of drama. Drama is meant to be skewered by the irrational and marked by folly. It is in our inherent conditions as humans. Though we aspire toward honor, rationality, and commitment, we discover an inward arc towards selfishness, wrath, greed, and envy. We are like Puck, that knavish sprite from A Midsummer's Night Dream, seducing others into imbibing his love potion. Tragedy only picks out those very scenarios and elevates them, heightens them to such an extent that we can garner the most profound cautionary lessons, and also insights into the deepest depths of the human spirit. As Goethe surmises, what in life we so often grieveth, in art we celebrate. Let us not make the same mistake as Euripides, who fell under the seductive spell of Socrates and his strictly irrational dialogues, which sucked the very life-giving essence out of theatre. When Plato, the philosopher king himself, spoke of the dialectic versus the mimesis, he had the guile to denigrate the latter as limited, meaning that when someone mimics a carpenter building a chair, his version is always 2 or 3 steps removed from that eternal form of truth, and cannot be taken seriously. Yet who isn't to say music isn't as flawless in form? Aristotle states that the octave is the perfect miracle of nature because of its adherence to a 2-to-1 ratio. Though I can commend Plato for his undeviating loyalty to the heavenly realms, at times we must pay homage to our earthly doings and the nature of reality, and in that respect, Aristotle succeeds. The 4 causes give credence to these very ideas: matter, form, efficiency, and purpose. We don't have knowledge of a thing until we've grasped its why, and its why is its cause. The potentiality versus actuality fits in accordance with our nature. But let me tell you, sycophantic Neoplatonists, where is this eternal truth? Where can we see its infallible excellence? Where, then, should I look and derive such certitude of fact? They are as fictitious as Leibniz's best of all possible worlds. That is why tragedy speaks of a higher truth. What is our duty as free spirits, if not to feel the pangs of life disrupt and shake the very foundation of our being? Most certainly, we could technically delineate such processes by the way of the sciences, but it has no place in the humanities. Science and logic are exceedingly respectable, belaboring tasks. They require research, analysis, examination, dialogues, evidence, epistemology, and a host of other resources at hand. They necessitate the labors of logical positivists like Russell or Carnap, and their endless commitment to validity and fact. For that we must revere them for their triumphs. Art requires the spirit to be free, free to cry out in pain, laughter, or sorrow. When we wed ourselves solely to the intellect, we divorce ourselves from our spirit, our sweet mistress, whom we should indulge illicitly in. We ought to be free to explore the very core of ourselves and bear it to the world, ever so vulnerably. Now, let me ask you, what does such Theban tragedy have to do with our friend Cameron? Well, though his life is certainly quotidian and abysmal enough, lacking in any strategies, bereft of challenges, utterly formulaic, prosaic, dull, and lackluster, he has something that we knowledgeable, erudite folk don't. He has glimpsed, even if for a moment, into the realm of the intangible and inscrutable visions, which are not quite accessible to everyone else. He has been fortunate enough to locate some semblance of an answer within the rubble of his quiescent life, and form it into a cohesive narrative. I'm only outlining this inexorable downfall, which I may add is entirely his own doing. This man has made a career out of answering to others, and has failed to find satisfaction even in that. This is the stuff of tragedies. Though it may appear on the surface that his life is very much average and predictable, it is ripe with the peculiar perks of being hostage to his own instinct and wild imagination. I know, because I myself am a denizen of it. I am a warden of endless pathos. He has a certain advantage, having access to particular avenues and into the deepest retreats of the soul, who has had the daring to follow that odd flicker of light, just like Macbeth, who, fueled by ambition, murders King Duncan and usurps the throne, and consequently has to keep killing a preponderance of more people in an effort to maintain his tyrannical power. Then, at the end of his reign, when he is besieged by enemy forces, he hears a woman scream, and admits that there would have been a time when it would have made his hairs stand up. However, he has seen so much slaughter and violence that it no longer perturbs him. Finally, after hearing of his wife's death, he delivers a solemn soliloquy that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This is the very essence of tragedy. While our friend Cameron has no blood on his hands, nor stories of wars and gallant bravery, it is clearly marked by a continual arc of execrable suffering, hardship, and loss, as is the case with all humanity. When I refer to him as the most tedious man, it was meant only as a riposte, and a harmless one at that. He has certainly demonstrated bravery, as shown by his encounters with Mr. Singer and other contentious people in his life. He has opened himself up to a lady friend, who seems to reciprocate his feelings for her. He is making progress. But what is progress in tragedy? He will no longer need the wise words of sages and intellectuals such as myself. He did everything right, but he failed in one area, though I regret nothing in the slightest, offering my assistance, as it drew me closer to my intended goals of absolution from intellectual burdens, Aufhebung, and absolute knowledge. He struck his inquisitive nose too far into this world and upset the status quo of the dream realm. Now all is at odds, and we must close the portal to both. This is no easy task. While it may appear that he means well, and he only wishes to see his life turn around for the better, Cameron has positively compromised our world, and he must pay reparations. At this point, the crowd erupted in deafening applause and riotous ovation. Rows of faceless people suddenly appeared in the audience and began mechanically clapping their hands in unison and shouting in a strange, unintelligible language. "I don't understand, Mr. Tiberias," Cameron exclaimed worrisomely. "I didn't do anything, as far as I know, that compromised your world. If anything, you jeopardized my world. Yes, I'll admit I needed help, and that even though I didn't consciously seek out you initially, my unconscious part did. I was at the end of my tether, and yes, I'll confess that I used alcohol to reach you, but I had no idea that this world was so fractious. I didn't ask to be dragged into any of this. I don't care if your world's rules don't conform to ours. It's wrong on every conceivable level to trick someone like that. And that is your method. Trickery. You have no place in my life. While you claim to be well-meaning and humanist in one moment, you'll change your mind and suddenly say you're a staunch intellectual. Well, which one are you? That's if you are anything at all, aside from a compendium of bad ideas. Cameron was a good distance away from Mr. Tiberias, who was now on an elevated plinth, gesturing with mad hands. His outfit suddenly changed to one less comical. A more working-class overcoat and a rather stylish bowler cap rested on his head. Unexpectedly, Mr. Tiberias' manner changed from one of upbeat alacrity to one of grave severity. He looked on steadily with one eye. Finally, he spoke. You really didn't know, did you? Of course I'm tricking you on some level. Everyone is in a constant state of manipulation in one form or another. We all have some traces of Machiavelli in us. We want things to go our way, so we seduce others and lead them into our wants and desires. Every feasible action performed by us is tied to a blind will. Even if we act out of apparent charity, we only fool ourselves because we tacitly wish to lessen our own suffering or boost our ego, which when we do such things. When I helped you, I cannot say that I was wholly exempt. Cameron had lost all patience. He didn't bother being subtle or tactful anymore. Cut the over-intellectual hypothetical garbage. Tell me what you are straight and simple. If you go off on one of your inane tangents again, I promise I'll cut this off. I don't know how, but I'll cut this short and I'll wake myself up. I'll will it. Cameron was waving his arms around, eagerly, almost as if this were a game that depended on the right button being pushed. Silly child, and then terrible, Mr. Tiberias cackled drolly. Did you really suppose it would be that easy? One cannot get around any subject without at least the most rudimentary epistemology at hand. We are constantly engaged in a discussion which requires cooperation from both parties. Did you already forget what I told you about Hegel? Remember the dialectic? Oh, please, don't tell me you've already forgot. Memory says, I did that. Pride replies, I could not have done that. Eventually, memory yields. Yes, I remember, Cameron admitted sternly. Don't see how that relates to this. You bring up hypotheticals, theories, shapes, and numbers, all of which are very thought-provoking and stimulating, but somewhere in the grand scheme of it, I can sense that it's also unnecessary, superfluous, and fruitless. It has no practical use in the real world. Sure, it's fun to sit with a book in your library sewer, but unlike you, I live in the real world, and I can't be bothered with your dangerous, foul ideas anymore. Yes, I said foul. They stink to high heaven. They reek of double-crossing, conniving lies. Somewhere in this propensity for philosophizing is a great, big, fat waste of time. Did I glean some things? Absolutely. But at the risk of going nearly insane with this endless stream of distressing thoughts that have done more harm than good. To accuse me of calumny? How amusing. What is this real world you speak of? I've yet to see it. It's all imaginary. A dreamt-up fancy of the delirious. So you think that I'm a meretricious sophist? Are my invectives too potent for you, my friend? To the point where you really cannot handle the weight of my words? Do they burden you? Perhaps it's time to expand your mind to greater horizons. You must discover that truth has no partiality and cannot mend itself to your whims. It is often brutish, heartless, but then again, so is life. This reminds me of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. One must surpass his teacher. Perhaps now is that time. Yet what is it that you have gleaned that is so worthwhile? Tell me, what original insights have you garnered? At this point, the front face of the stadium trembled slightly. The odd, faceless creatures in the audience remained steadfast and mechanical-looking. Clothed in drab, gray felt, they looked more like clay figures than human people, and when they moved their extremities they did not bend at the joint, but oddly inward at a curve. Cameron attempted a refutation. Mr. Tiberias, I understand where you're coming from, and I definitely appreciate the wise advice, even though you've also suggested some questionable things. But I cannot risk myself being under your influence any longer. You're out of my control. My sense of connection to reality is being strained. The more we speak, the looser my grasp on truth is. The more you go off in your endless speeches, be they political or philosophical, the more I see myself drifting into doubt and unrest. You're only adding more fuel to the fire. I can hardly speak anymore without you taking over with your devilish ideas and intoxicating every word I say. Sure, you may have helped me assert myself, which has opened up new and exciting avenues in my life, and for that I'm truly indebted. but the stakes you cost me are too high. I'm beginning to assert myself again, not at the demons of my everyday life, but from the ones within. I must dispel a host of them, and fortunately, you are one of them." Cameron spoke clearly and passionately. Nevertheless, Mr. Tiberias was committed to his theatrics. "I commend you, my young earthly friend, my dear Cameron, our petit prince. You finally caught on. It took you long enough. So as it happens, I am Legion. What joy! How should I go about this? Shall you cast me out into a herd of pigs tumbling desolately into the ocean?" Mr. Tiberias was now waving his arms and pointing his fingers in the gesture of casting something out. The platform he stood on began to rise higher. "You've got it exactly right," exclaimed Cameron. "I'm here to cast you out once and for all." He could not stop himself from motioning wildly with his forefinger in an accusatory signal, but not in a mocking way that Mr. Tiberias had been doing. At this point, Cameron felt totally in control of his body, and none of his motions felt compelled. "And how exactly will you do that, my friend? What little magic trick have you conjured up? What florid, elaborate phrases of psychology have you learnt? What skill have you up your sleeve? Will you cast me out like one of those Catholic prelates or abbots grabbing me and uttering Veda retro satana? Have I become that saprogenic and febrile to you? Am I but a decaying, pungent husk? Is this a declaration of nullity? Have I become rendered legally void like those papers you copy so often? Do as you wish, then. Throw me to the wolves. What does it matter if I appear real or not? To be quite frank, you appear to me as quite artificial, nothing more than an erstwhile faded remembrance of a person. I can see you right now amid some kind of funeral procession, a dance macabre, a ghost. Don't look so astoundingly offended. You said so yourself. Feel invisible." "Not any more," declared Cameron in a barely audible whisper, his voice slowly rising. "I feel entirely present, even in this hellscape." "What was that now?" Mr. Tiberias' head jerked upward at an angle, with an expression of newfound interest. "I said not any more," Cameron exclaimed, stridently this time without hesitation. "Oh, look what we have, ladies and gentle Thyestes men. Our friend has gained the very first and necessary trait of a tragic hero. He has obtained an ability to take a stand against the prevailing malevolent forces in his life. Please offer your most enthusiastic applause. He is making progress. The next step is to introduce naysayers into those who add ancillary conflict. It will heighten the eventual climactic battles of wits that will take place not in this theater, but the theater of life. That is when the epilogue will begin. A spiritual denouement. Let's see how well he can fare in the Colosseum of wit. He's certainly progressed quite a lot, as opposed to when he first came slogging to us with his myriad of troubles like a mendicant." Mr. Tiberias was dancing wildly as he spoke in a stentorian, thunderous voice that echoed throughout the amphitheater in a way that was silly, theatrical, and foolish all at once. In response, machine-like spectators made a racket of clamoring applause, which lasted several seconds. "I've had enough of your ridiculous, meaningless speeches. I'm through with you. Go back to where you came from and leave me alone," Cameron shouted feverishly, pointing his fingers accusingly in the face of Mr. Tiberias, who is now several feet in the air on his pedestal, taking a certain sick pride in elevating himself above everything else. "You may be through with me, but I am not through with you," Mr. Tiberias proclaimed in a hushed, portentous tone, setting his inimical eye unwaveringly on Cameron, who attempted to evade his stare. But it was no use. He could see everything. "Oh, leave it be! Leave me be! What did I do to deserve your hellish treatment?" Cameron exclaimed, shielding his eyes from the iridescence that suddenly radiated from behind Mr. Tiberias. Where it came from, he was not entirely certain. It could have been the second sun, which was revolving around the first at a faster rate, and had nothing to augment its influence. But nothing was certain in this place. Everything was in a constant state of unforeseeable change. "Oh my, please forgive my amusement," said Mr. Tiberias. "The entertainment never ceases. It pours forth like a plenteous fountain. Can't you take a hint? I guarantee you, the answer to all your inquiries is right in front of you. But you're too stalwart and nearsighted to see. You're too incapable of seeing what's right in front of you." "What do you mean?" asked Cameron. "Oh, don't act like you didn't know what was so bloody obvious the whole time," Mr. Tiberias blurted out. "I swear you must be the greatest and most capable actor, or the dumbest character ever to live. I know for a fact that you had something up your sleeve. You spoke of deals and agreements, but you never followed through. I had a vague intimation that you weren't everything that you said you were, and that though you defy any definitions that you weren't being fully upfront. I never thought you would cheat me like you have. I just knew it. Just like you did in Mr. Spencer. Oh, my poor dim-witted boy, explained Mr. Tiberias, partly derisively, then exploding into obsessive mania. You had no idea, do you? Simply put, I am you, but bigger, cleverer, more assertive, more demanding, more authentic, and more knowing. I see past this world of mere appearances. Either that, or I am merely a psychological projection of your innermost desires, a visual display of consciousness, an astral, out-of-body experience of seeing your own eye bloated to distorted size, pampered by wealth and pastries, idle and intellectual to the bone. I am just an approximation of mental display of grandeur mixed with a silly sensibility, a tedious old man at a party, recycling old and new ideas, harmless and jovial, take your pick. I am no hell beast here to curse you with eternal fire and torment. My ways are not auspicious to the tormentors of hell. I'm not like the others. My methods are quite different. I'm not here to impale you with spikes like an Iron Maiden, or to stretch you from limb to limb in a bed of Procrustes, or even to openly mock you while I snicker malevolently. I had a specific task in mind when they created me and sent me. I'm your personal hell. I will torture you with sardonic remarks, prod you with pithy, two-faced monologues, test your limits with muddled, intellectual, vexatious, vague, and meaningless banter. I will play the fool only to offer wisdom later. I will preach sanctity, chastity, and law, only to level it with immoral, bitter wickedness, and encourage a libertine life like Mephistopheles. Did you sincerely believe that all that religious nonsense I bloviated about? Ha! I will bore you to death with endless wiseacre, didactic, superfluous, prescriptive, normative ideology. I will offer one way of living and thinking only to contradict myself and spin up an entirely new one. I am pathological lawlessness incarnate. I revel watching you reel over in confusion in moments not unlike this one. Do not fall into Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Remember where you came from. Mr. Tiberias spoke in a distraught manner, fluttering his arms in vehement circles. At this point, he punctuated his monologue with a long, diabolical guffaw. Cameron was completely at a loss, as his mouth agape and eyes fixed straight in front of him. He had no idea what to make of all this, how much of Mr. Tiberias's criticisms were simply intended to dismay him, or whether or not it was done out of mere theatrics. I don't need any of this. I don't need you. You're insane. I refuse to believe you even exist, Cameron said in a near stammer, almost spitting in Mr. Tiberias's direction. You may say you don't need me or heed my words, yet I live through you and you breathe my mind. I dwell within your very silence, said Mr. Tiberias in a calm yet emotionally vacant manner. In between your worlds and dreams, I appear as the seductions and persuasions you present to the world in order to go about in a sane manner. I am the author of your most enticing ideas. I am the reflection of your inner solace, and charity tinged and fraught with moral penury. I am all those things. I am an idea, an abstraction. By the way, who is the matter? The one who points out the flaws of one's character and offers reinforcement, wisdom, and knowledge, and wishes to better his life overall as Bentham would have wished? Or the one who's dragged themselves into a frenzy, chaotic abyss of a storm, the eye of the storm? It is you, my friend, who has lost all their wits. I'm afraid you're a lost cause. I really wish I could assist you further, but I sincerely cannot. Even in the deepest slip into this grasp of a dizzy, somnolent hum of pure reverie, everything you acted out was deliberate, volitional, and to your liking, even if you didn't feel like it was you doing it, but the hand of a phantom manipulator. I cannot take any credit for what you have done, my friend. You sought this out via pure, what did Schopenhauer call it? The will to your surrounding Umwelt. What you did was the most natural course of action. It wasn't simply in your head. It wasn't, as Freud called it, wish fulfillment. Some people simply doze off and get a hint of what a more tolerable, pleasurable life would be like. But then they wake up to the mundane reality and forget it ever happened. You fashioned your ideal life out of the remnants of your imagination. You didn't simply dream and project idle visions. You acted them out. And now here you are. Though you took action against your boss and made positively fruitful decisions in your life, you foolishly tossed me away like some extraneous, broken tool once you've exercised your desired result. This is inevitable. Because of this, you are at a standstill, at the final window of sundry opportunity, at the cusp of finality. This is your penultimate supposition, a most determinative one at that. How will you spend it? Cameron was astonished. Struck still like a stone statue, he gradually raised his hands to his face to hide himself from Mr. Tiberias, who rose even higher than before and surveyed the whole of the land. Attempting to find it within himself to respond, Cameron stammered out vitriolically, "I knew it! I knew it! You were lying this entire time! You're a two-faced devil! I'm not putting up with your schemes any longer! I don't ever want to see you again!" "Unfortunately, my dear friend, that's not up to you," Mr. Tiberias stated grimly. "In what way could you possibly hold me accountable for your myopia, my child? Be the author of your own wrongs. Do not displace the blame onto someone else. I merely endeavored to help you. Though the world you interact with and endure every day is every bit as real as it seems, you can taste the tawdry food and soak in the turbid, repellent colors and feel the plaster walls. It is in actuality every bit as deceptive as I am to you. An abstraction, rooted in an idea, in the flawed perception of reality, a mutant, grotesque stain, a bastardization. It cannot help you, and offers no solace. While my world is unsettling, grotesque even, I offer you truth untampered and unrestrained. It may be ugly, but it is honesty with no bargain or compromise. Yet, shield your face in tears aplenty." Mr. Tiberias was correct. Cameron was weeping, yet it didn't feel as if he were overtaken by sadness or even anger, but only by a potent sense of dread that overwashed him. Quickly, he noticed that his tears were blood-red, and when they dripped down to the ground they burned through it like incendiary material. However, before Cameron could even react and amass this new multitude of events, Mr. Tiberias's voice rang out like a trumpet or a wretched siren. "To expound on things even more, I am in fact from the official consulate of interdimensional human affairs, a multifarious corporation that deals with proper mending of souls in need of surplus self-development, inner growth, impartation of wisdom, and a novel furnishing of intellect and spirit. And last but not least, this business of bargaining with souls, as they put it, as ridiculous as it sounds, I am in fact a high-ranking official and dignitary. To be even more precise, I am well aware of that brevity is not my forte. I deal with all manner of things pertaining to both personal growth and supplanting of NY via intense one-on-one sessions that are designed to grip your mind and influence you by way of dialectic. For instance, I introduce a challenge, and you take it via instruction by comedy, tragedy, and drama. Yet this challenge is deceptive, as it may occur to you that there is more than meets the eye in this avenue of growth. Although it may seem as if I stood a great distance from you, immersed in my books, in my study, that I may have never even so much as laid a hand on you aside from our formal greetings, I have effectively broken down your inhibitions and worldly worries to a point where you are pure essence. It's astoundingly gorgeous in full sight. It took some considerable time for your hesitations and doubts to subside. Eventually, they broke down into a fine powder, the first blow being when you faced that insidious boss of yours, and the second being when you faced your greatest fear. Change and fluctuation in the form of Cecil, who will subsume all other dogmas in your life. Now that you are deteriorated and broken, in the best of all possible ways, of course, the two formerly opposing worlds of dream and reality are now colliding in harmony. But there is one last thing left. We need your final, pure spirit, your immaterial Dasein. Your metaphysical pure self is the very last item required on this elaborate cooking list. Once we obtain that, the portal to both worlds will run seamlessly, as if there hadn't been any schism in the first place. Mr. Tiberias revealed all this with an obvious air of malevolent satisfaction, hopping around frenetically. Cameron felt the trepidation begin to pass through him, and a sense of newfound courage at his hands. What if I don't want the worlds to collide? I don't know what that entails, and I sure as hell don't trust you. I'm not going through with this, Cameron stated explicitly. It's not up to you. Besides, the process has already begun. What is there to be so fearful of? The final part requires total trust on your part, for you to drop all inhibitions and offer your spirit up for this newfound world of both idea and freedom. Then leave behind your old world of a crepuscular, fading daylight. Think of all the new possibilities you can find within this new world. Once fully synthesized, it will allow for the complete transaction of spirit, will, and ideas and emotions from one person to the other. There will be no need for language or even speaking, because we will communicate simply through our minds. Admittedly, we'll need to tap into a certain aspect of your mind in order for this to work, but don't worry. We won't lay a hand on you. We've only extracted the minimal required amount of energy from the inactive, dormant brain while you are fast asleep. Think of the outcomes, though. In this shared collective, one will merely think and it will be heard. It will be a society of free spirits and active minds who hunger for knowledge, who could forge brand new ideas from the workings of our minds. We could even forge brand new ideas from the workings of your minds without running the risk of plagiarism. We will have one collective, shared unconscious that can update and reinforce its overall productiveness. It will be a mammoth hive brain, capable of generating endless interactive, enhanced forms and shapes of information far more advanced than any quantum supercomputer. All we need is your cooperation. So much is at stake. I understand your apprehension, but the benefits will be boundless. The ailments and insufficiencies of our bodies will be a relic of the past. That is, once each person's individual qualia, being pure consciousness, is connected to this communal cerebral sphere. It will be far more complex than simply a shared state of societal beliefs and values, as Durkheim posited. It will be a ceaselessly upgrading, self-repairing, constantly intermingling set of brainwaves in a state of plasticity that any new form of information can egress through. There will be no room for noxious, predictable human behavior such as mimesis, disputes, unfaithfulness, and the typical problems that ail ordinary people. There will be no need for it. Indeed, there won't be any room for even the consideration of those ideas. These minds will be pure energy, in a transcendental, almost numinous state, with no potentiality of evil schemes within it. People's minds, once properly adjusted, will be in a perpetual state of Tibetan calm or Stoic ataraxia. It will be, simply put, heaven for all. Mr. Tiberias said all this with a sense of merciless pride, twisting his mouth into a skewered smile that upset Cameron almost as much as the speech itself. He took a couple of paces back with evident suspicion. His previous bout of temerity seemed to have quickly waned. Still attempting to hide from Mr. Tiberias's ever-watching eye, he exclaimed, "I want nothing more to do with your insane, corrupt lies. Nothing about your vision is remotely appealing, no matter how advanced, pleasing, or safe or harmonious you claim it to be. Also, you talk about being free of duplicity and lies, yet this is exactly what you engender. It just sounds purely maniacal based on my instincts." "Oh, what fun you are! Are these same supposed instincts you use to gauge your career choices and taste in attire? If so, I wouldn't trust them in the slightest. I would go the way of Socrates and listen to your inner daemon. On second thought, it did lead him to adhere to honesty so much that his life was put on trial and he was executed with hemlock by his fellow Greek statesmen. But I digress. Listen, Cameron. Do not be mistrustful. Remember my abilities. I can see exceedingly well." Mr. Tiberias's outward behavior became increasingly more demented and obscene as he began stamping on the pedestal with his cane. As he did so, it caught fire that momentarily grew into a great ball that ate everything around it. The large monolith he stood on began to move around as well. "I've had enough of your madness. I don't want to hear anything else from you. Understand?" Cameron shouted with a newfound decisiveness that came out of nowhere. When he spoke this way, he felt the ground begin to tremble slightly, but stopped after only a few seconds. "Oh, what's this now?" Mr. Tiberias began mockingly, his voice becoming more and more treacherous as its timbre fractured into a most unsettling tone. "You've become so self-assured it's breaking my heart, my dear boy. I never knew a passive little pipsqueak like yourself would ever even be able to muster up the courage to do anything but stand idly by as your life devours you in a brutal flash of fire. Besides, I was the one who taught you how to act this way. I'd thought you'd stand there forever enslaved by your own bovine, docile impassiveness. Those who claim that they are pacifists are really unimaginative, spiritless cadavers in disguise. What else do you have for us today? What great show of courage and audacity will you perform? I love good play acting." "I'm serious," Cameron said, forebodingly. "I don't know what deceitful tricks you have up your sleeve, but I'm not putting up with your foul, insidious behavior anymore. My patience is all used up." Cameron felt exhausted. His eyelids were heavy, and his arms and legs felt weighty. "You're joking, aren't you?" Mr. Tiberias asked, but didn't allow for Cameron to respond. Well, you're certainly committed to this act of yours. What is it about me that you loathe so much? Who is it that guided you from the start? Who was it that aided you in your somber, grim life? Who was it that stood by you faithfully like a bride of sorts and contended with your every conundrum, no matter how puzzling? Who is it that never forsook you or made a fool of you, only offering every bit of sagacity and knowledge and perspicacity? Truth be told, I was admittedly a tad rough around the edges. My life has been a most interesting array of events, both calamitous and conducive to my present character. It has shaped me into what I am, and I wouldn't alter one detail of it. I have lived out so many different existences, endless personalities, now soon to be woven together into one entirety of being, free of my own selfishness and egotism. Even the grey skies which have come to occupy my mind I want to remain as a bitter friend, rather than an unfriendly pest. I have come to accept those dreadful moments with as much readiness and acceptance as the prosperous ones. I choose to accept my life in amor fati. If that's the case, would you accept death? Cameron asked, his tired eyes peaked with sudden interest. As I said, anything that comes along, I'm ready to embrace it. I will be as Seneca was in his final hour, facing imminent death at the hands of his fellow Romans, who suspected that he was in a plot to kill Nero. So they decided to coerce the man to cut his veins to bleed to death. His wife, in the midst of her bereavement, joined her husband, but ended up surviving. Will you do likewise? Will I die at the hand of my fate simply for wanting the universe to be better off? For wanting to introduce honor and wisdom to others? So be it. Have me killed. What pitiless tragedy great men meet for simply telling the truth. Mr. Tiberias, Cameron began adamantly, you speak of truth, yet you offer a myriad of different ideas, values, and a host of other options I can't even begin to understand or digest. I am a simple man, and you have only made everything more complicated. While you have helped me along the way, in my own journey of self-discovery, I can't help but feel as though you held up a light in the dark, only to offer even more darkness. I feel like I'm lost in a labyrinth of illusions, with each layer of reality as indecipherable as the next. Cameron said this in a much more natural way than he had before. So be it, croaked Mr. Tiberias morbidly, shocking Cameron with his sudden burst of vitriol. This was the most bitter and unceremonious Cameron had ever seen him, as he arose ominously from the orb of fire, which appeared not to affect him in the least. This orb was roughly 12 feet tall, a few feet in width, slowly growing. A few feet from Cameron, he could directly feel the sensation of it on his skin. It wasn't a stinging feeling, but the voluminous glowing substance made his hair stick up, and he took several steps away. He wasn't entirely sure whether Mr. Tiberias was doing these things as an affectation or from genuine disapproval. Go back to your timorous, sad life. I want nothing more to do with you. I offered what little help I could. I stretched my hand out to you in the most solicitous way possible. I did so not out of any philosophical, ethical system, but because I had the audacity to truly care. Like Don Quixote, who wanted nothing more than to preserve charity and chivalry in an age where such values were absent, I am benighted by your ignorant ways. You are a lost cause, a broken person, a damaged spirit who hasn't a backbone to hold your amorphous membrane together, so you despairingly fall apart. Well, I'm not going to patch you together again. Cursed be the hammer and anvil that forged thee. Cursed be the womb that bore thee. And he followed this statement with an utterance unlike any language Cameron had ever heard, that was so alien that he was inclined to dismiss it as gibberish, although it did retain a certain semblance of a pattern in its inflection. He began stamping his feet furiously on the ground, which began to shake even more violently than before. Cameron latched onto a nearby pillar, which offered only minimal support. The faceless entities that occupied the audience suddenly simmered with boiling heat and eventually crumbled to ashes before his eyes. You know nothing, Mr. Tiberias began again. I was here, before everything. Before this earth I was wandering peripatetically from land to land. I've always been a roamer and a hermit. I've had countless bodies before this one, some stranger than this. I've had innumerable faces, endless personalities, a corpus of lives no two alike. I am the embodiment of eternal return and reincarnation, reliving each life anew without harboring the baggage of the old one. Each of my bodily form fails to latch on to an immaterial spirit that will subsist through decay and inevitable death. Yet I found a way to manifest different objects, and I lamentably settled on this one before you. This isn't about otherworldly spells or demons. This is about the vastness of time and space, and how anything is possible with a little imagination. I wouldn't kill you to entertain the possibility, the piquant exaltation of novelty. I always sacrificed my body for the infinite kernel because the Buddhists were right. There is a consistent, perpetual being that resides and permeates within all living things. Yet, within me is nothing. I am nothing. I am no one. Not even potentiality. Leibniz's Entelechy, or Hans Driesch's Vitalism, which claimed that each conscious being contains its own entire universe. I am pure idea, untainted representation incarnate. I am the clouds passing over in the horizon with the fleeting ciphers only to dissipate. I am a spellbound idler who spits out words of vacant cunning. There is no real me. I am only a facile, temporary construct, that which is inexplicable, intoxicating yet infuriating. If Kant proposed that there was a thing in itself that could exist independent of our senses, let me be the first to proclaim that I am the inverse to this. I exist only when you exist. You summoned up like a phantom for your needs. You needed a role model, an arch sage, a prophet, a cloistered mystic with the rationale to temper him out, a character with equal portions intellect and religion, of asceticism and hedonism. A futile puff of smoke that disappears before your eyes even see it, a ghost, an unfathomable, unrelenting ghost. Mr. Tiberias' voice became increasingly weaker and more solemn, as his usual joie de vivre eluded him. He looked utterly dejected amid the flame engulfing him. Cameron was speechless. Still clutching onto the pillar, he braced himself as the ground began to tremble more vigorously. It looked as if there were some kind of force underground that was springing upward, crashing through the rocky surface and bulging considerably. This wave of tremulous motion was enough to shatter the entire theater, rendering all columns unstable. Cameron continued to clutch on for safety. By some divine stroke of luck, he was only hit by a small stone which struck his left temple, giving him a hefty bruise. The genuine realness of that rock made Cameron so fearful that he covered himself underneath a broken arch while offering protection. All that mattered to him was surviving by whatever means possible. He was no longer repeating himself, "This isn't real. I'm going to wake up now. This is all a dream." Cameron only accepted what was going on as a means to vie for his life. He had no other choice. It didn't matter whether it was all dreamt up or as real as his familiar office walls. What mattered was that he was fighting for the survival of his mind and sanity, which appeared to him to be inseparably linked. Cameron readied himself again in anticipation, but only a feverish, direful cackle was heard coming from the flames where Mr. Tiberias had been. His shadow appeared for a brief moment, displaying his clawed hands and portentous eyes, revealing searing dissatisfaction with everything it observed. He wasn't finished yet. He had more to say. With a dismally disfigured, strained voice, he proclaimed, "Don't look so dejected. I have to go sometime. As it happens, I am not the persistent survivor of time I made myself out to be, and I wasn't as inviolable as I thought. For so long I felt as though I were a kind of iconoclastic luminary of Napoleonic caliber, as Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov thought he was. But nay, I am but a feeble old miser with too many ideas fomenting in my god-forsaken brain for my own good. Something in me just shattered, and I think that it was you who made me come tumbling down like Babel. I am friable glass ready to be broken, or a small incendiary device, as my old good friend Octavian would have put it. Yet everything I had preached has been utterly useless. I spoke for hours at a stretch about my bold plans pertaining to the future of these grim worlds and how I would unify the two, and I was partly successful. Yet, like Icarus, flying on the wings crafted by his skilled father Daedalus, I let my own pride overtake me. I should have realized the errors in my ways. I became too bold, too certain of my own abilities. Curse me back to Eden from whence I came. O doomed garden of gardens, cursed by mortality, take me to Elysium fields, my place of refuge, the hopeful prospects of a blessed afterlife. Endow me with the wisdom of Sophia, that divine, gentle spirit. I should have heeded it. Give me the courage of Hypatia in her final hour. Trying to demystify me is akin to pursuing a chimera. I am indefinable. Let it be known that before I disintegrate so pitiably into a plume of smoke that I was only a boundless dream, an unkempt apparition, only a schema of something vaguely real, seen through distorted lens. I was never here and never will be. I am both present and removed at the same time. At this point, Mr. Tiberias' voice flattened into a weak timbre, but was still audible. The overpowering plume of smoke enclosing him was advancing so slowly that he had time to speak at length. I am the product of your repressed ingenuity, which consumed you in a fervent penal servitude and was faithfully superseded by the universal demiurge that struck me into existence. I was but a momentary flame, though I thought I was infinite, an echo into the minds of men, a reflection of their innermost desires, which spout out like a fountain of unrealized possibility. I was but a shade of their own mortifying beasts within. If you are indeed the one who is dreaming, then what am I but the one dreamed of, the one summoned by a spell of the imagination? What am I but the fragmented abstract vestiges that lay betwixt your belabored dream and real world, occupying the same ranks as those cobwebs in your mind? You live as one haunted by your own misgivings, amid the cleft of the real and unreal. Yet I myself am slipping away, never to be seen again, like the library of Alexandria, besieged and slowly torn apart by those who feared its breadth of knowledge. The Gnostic ideologies, namely the Nassanis, a fragment of Hippolytus's day, spoke of a second Adam, one who came before the first man and who was much better off not existing at all. This Adam isn't a seminal patriarch of mankind in its original prideful sin, but instead a destroyer of all things beautiful or formulaic. The angels of Elohim took some of the best earth and then formed men. According to the Midrash, the Gnostic Adam did not receive his soul until God and the earth joined to make it. Strange demiurges forged iron out of dirt, the causal eminence from which everything derives, air, water, earth, fire, and of course the quintessence of everything, ether. He was in truth the very antithesis of what they sought to create in their own image, precision and pure impeccability. He awoke the dreamer, one whose carnal spirit sought flesh and avarice instead of purity. His creator was not one of the divine spirits who craft pure souls, but a spectre of belaboring intrigue and subterfuge. This Adam found life was only suffering, as the Buddhists said, and it was a nightmare never to be awoken from. I believe that the spirit of the second man dwells within all men to this day, and fosters a desire for corruption, envy, and greed. Some of us carry distant memories, fragments subsisting over vast dimensions and past lives that must be integrated into a cohesive story lest we go mad. We recall thoughts and ideas that are not our own. We have a separate effigy from ourselves, fashioned exactly like us, who has lived different lives and has their own stories to tell. Perhaps a version of ourselves lived out a life as a postman or a simple clerk in Europe, which had become one whole state unified under a collective government, under varying circumstances rooted in a miasma of possibility. There are infinitely various aggregations and suppositions to be made of this. The Hindu Vedas teach a creation myth involving a world egg and extrication of damned mortals. The Eastern religions, however, differ in the sense that they strongly emphasize the recurrence of events. Eventually, however, they too fade into memory as their physical bodies become saprogenic and decay into oblivion. Their memories persist through time and enter the spheres of the unconscious mind and slip into dreams, even in the states where our minds are still vulnerable. Most people live in a kind of idle dream and delete these memories out of fear. They hold on to a delusory assessment of the self, but you had faith, held on and tried to make sense of them. Ah, what is eternity anyway? A labyrinth of inestimable libraries, as Borges suggests. Would one not go completely mad if that were the case? Even if encased within lay the keys to the meaning of life? Or is it the ego to the darkness, as written in the Zohar, in the story of a man aboard a ship who spots another man drilling a hole in the floor? The man is incensed and demands to know what he is doing. I am drilling a hole in my ship because it is my own. To this the man replies, "You fool! A hole will sink the ship!" This displays the destructive nature of the ego and how selfish impetuses will only further the entropy and disharmony of humanity. But I digress yet again. Mr. Tiberias continued to speak with a broken, frail voice as the cloud of smoke began to swell around him. It was quite a gloomy, dismal sight for Cameron, and he couldn't help but feel pangs of sorrow and pity for the strange creature. "Wait, you don't have to leave," he exclaimed disconsolately. At this, the ground began to ease up and stop shaking, although the amphitheater had now been shattered into countless pieces which were strewn about. "What is happening to you? I didn't intend for this to happen, but you seem dead set on causing trouble. I just wanted to set my life in order, and I wanted things to go back to normal, but perhaps I got a little carried away. You can stay. I just wanted things not to be so difficult." But it appeared that Cameron was too late. Mr. Tiberias's vague figure gradually disappeared into the milky haze surrounding him, his eyes still somewhat visible. But now it was not the treacherous, scheming eye that had put so many people at ill at ease. It was far more tender and resigned this time. He spoke ardently with a voice that continued to falter and break. "It's too late. While it's certainly not your doing that I am leaving, which is a wonderful thing, there were other factors at large. It was the workings of these damned powers that be, the same ones who cursed me to this body and left me on that train. They want me to suffer for what I've done with the portal. I've compromised their whole system with my dissident ways. The way I acted to you, my seemingly spiteful larks, were only to provoke in you the assertiveness you so needed to be autonomous, and free yet again. I did it only in your best interests. Once again, I'm sorry, Cameron. I do not hesitate to call you a friend. We've had our punch-ups and struggles, yet I admire you in many respects. You're diligent, sane, normal, and lastly, you completed the final act of your own tragedy, which I am not ashamed to call an efficacious story for the ages. As for me, I cannot possibly compare. To exist in the modern world as an eccentric is to not exist at all. There is no place for madmen such as myself. Like Blake, I sought to create for myself my own system so as not to be enslaved by another. Yet I was too caught up in my own ego. I sought to become so many things at once in a flight of a self-absorbed fancy. I misguidingly believed myself to have a sovereign will of my own. But yet, what am I but a plaything of the gods? A mere morsel of infinitesimal, cosmic ash to be devoured by the Sphinx, that ancient beast whose mystifying riddle persevered since ancient times, the very same one that rivaled Oedipus, for it is her inscrutable riddle since the dawn of self-inquiry and truth-seeking that led you here. Am I correct? The rationalists of today will claim that these ancient noble ideas, and every grain of wisdom they offered was merely a misstep in civilization, to be rightfully replaced with the idle profligacy of modernity. O Egypt, lead me into the promised land. Decipher mea tu devoro. At this point, Mr. Tiberias spoke a long, mournful eulogy of sorts, which he gasped out in almost a whisper. "A world that is fickle, a world that is vain, is no proper place for but a saint. In a treasure trove of copper and nickel, worth only a little, I found myself to blame, and I have no name. Fate, O mother of all delusion, to walk upon the faceless troves, denizens of the empty cataract, one dreams of a gossamer angel, recherche moonlight, coruscating, but receives instead a bestial prowler, one who perforates all happiness with its foul tusks, reducing the most mirthful ones into gloomy spectacles, where mendacity and turpitude reigns. Remember Cecil. Do not let her compassion and insight fly over your head. Love her with a love I could never find within myself. Offer her only your utmost tenderness. Do not mistreat her with sullen disregard, or subject her to endless arrogant harangues as I did. I apologize sincerely once more for my foolish tirades. I only intend the best." "Mr. Tiberias," Cameron shouted with immense grief, tears forming in his eyes, "I want you to know that even though you never cease to confuse and irritate me, and we've had our disagreements, I'm sorry for not agreeing to your plan. I couldn't find it within myself to believe you. I've just been afraid of taking that leap. Maybe it sounds absurd, but you've helped me in some ways. Our differences reinforced each other. You were right in some ways. Whereas I was stubborn, superficial, tedious, and foolish, you were enthusiastic, original, decisive, and creative. I couldn't help but feel a great gap between us that never seemed to reconcile. Each day I've had to convince myself that I needed to change, where you never questioned your need for growth and understanding. Even during hardships, you've always kept abreast with whatever circumstances you happen to be in. I always doubted. I was timid and insecure, especially about the future. But you've shown me that there's no need to be afraid any longer. For that, I am sincerely thankful." Cameron was on the verge of weeping. It appeared that Mr. Tiberias slipped increasingly further away into the fog that enveloped him. Only the glowing garnet pupil of his eye was visible, like a lambent flame. "I must be going now. I'm forever thankful I could be of some help during my ephemeral life. Like the mayfly I spoke of, we only have minutes to assess, face, understand, and most of all love our little existences before they fade out like the brief candles that resound in the endless vast cosmos. Like Hegel taught, I have reached the universal and have striven to use my abilities for the better good. But now, of course, within this shared community of limitless consciousness, there will no longer be any need for any dialectics pertaining to Marxist Hegelian thought. All scores will be settled. We will all be on one plane with no need for competition, as we do not need to procure food or resources in this bodily form. In this final dictum, I recant all ego, and give myself up to this eternal sleep, this leap into the unknown that is not as daunting as one might think. I see only a patina of light, and overabundance. I hear singing, too, much like those Latin antiphons or cantatas I mentioned, that came from those holy churches. I can hear the melange of human and otherworldly voices melding together in pure harmony and song. I can see all kinds of characters here. Who is that? I recognize Zeno Revelia. Look, there's Democritus. Thales, too. Lucan and Seneca. I feel akin to Tristan when he took the love potion that made him fall for Isolde. Alas, I can see clouds of pure white, a forest of a grand rainbow eucalyptuses. If this is really eternity, then I do not deserve such luxuries. I must take this leap into pure spirit, that state of neutrality and non-knowingness. That is why I was stuck in that wretched room. I was too proud and unwilling to take that dive past my own staunch ignorance, so I became wedged between my own perilous wisdom and a penchant for sophistry. Cameron felt his way through the cloud of smoke, which was beginning to turn opaque and to mask Mr. Tiberias' face almost entirely. One last time he spoke. His words echoed in a strange reverberation, vibrating around Cameron as though there were speakerphones next to his ears. The words bawled out in a dismal whimper. "One last time, my friend. I wish no ill will. Find it in your heart to understand, for reasons I cannot fully expound on, I needed to use methods which you understandably find quite questionable. However, during the entirety of my time with you, I wanted nothing but the best for you. I know full well that while my vanity and coarseness caused confusion, but to put it as plainly as I can, I needed to act coarsely in order to cause the final bout of tension needed to open these gates. It required action on your part, and I knew you had it in you. Now the portal must be sealed again before it is too late. Now that my work here is done, I can dissipate wonderfully into oblivion. How delightful! I am swiftly dispersing into the most mollifying nullity. I am soon to be emergent dust, which will join the ranks of stellar debris. I must take my place on the stage of the universe, one that is all-defining, all-accepting, ready to integrate myself among their fairer kind. My work is done. Sieste fait. Goodbye, Cameron." And with that, Mr. Tiberias' voice slipped into obscurity, never to be heard by Cameron again. His figure had been nigh invisible for some time, but now it completely vanished as cracks in the ground opened up, revealing a swelling, fuming layer of magma underneath, which swallowed up Mr. Tiberias in one seamless movement. It was not clear whether or not this was a painful experience, though judging from the half-smile still faintly visible on his face, Cameron was inclined towards the latter. He did not protest in the slightest, only looked on placidly with an expression of profound contentment, the imperturbable Buddha Tiberias had spoken so much of, achieving total serenity at last. It was as if he had expected this to happen the entire time and accepted it with utmost resignation. Was he right about the two worlds? Perhaps he had succeeded. His ideal vision of a shared community of enlightened minds could very well have turned out to be the best of all possible scenarios. Perhaps he was right, and he really had ended up in a coterie of egoist-like minds. Or perhaps he was just mad, and the contents of his interpolations were just vaguely abstracted dreams, as he was. Either way, Cameron felt a sense of intense grief over his loss. It was like Mr. Tiberias had been a peculiar but affable friend, a distant relative even, one who you feel both an off-putting distance from but a surprising warmth and connection to. He was so many things. He was a myriad of different shapes, sizes, ideas, personas, and concepts that could hardly be contained into any one form. Soon after Mr. Tiberias's evanescence, Cameron was overcome by an overwhelming, arresting radiance that presented itself not in a variegated display of shadow or colors, but purely as one radiant sphere of light which nearly blinded him, not in the painful way, only through an extreme abundance which transitioned him into a placidly sleeping, unconscious state. Soon afterwards, he would awake. But as he slipped off into this state, he couldn't help but fear that he too would vanish into non-existence or whatever plane of reality Mr. Tiberias had spoken of. Yet he felt his trepidation only for a moment, before blissful reassurance took over his entire being, and he was engulfed by what felt like pure, unadulterated calm that manifested itself like stardust, the ashes of the cosmos in a beneficent cyclone. When he awoke, Cameron was certain that he was still here, but Mr. Tiberias had gone through that mysterious portal. Whether it had been as painless as he claimed, Cameron would never know. Had he been a spell of the imagination? Was he created by the ill-advised misuse of prescription drugs mixed with an unhealthy mind? Or was he really one of those demons Cameron had read so much about? We will never truly know for certain. What was for certain, however, was that Cameron felt like a changed person that day. He awoke from the delirious state in a surprising state of calm, to the familiar gray and beige wallpaper around him in his modest two-bedroom home. For a moment or so, he could even vaguely hear the distant chuckle, that enthusiastic, witty laughter of both a foolish sophist and a passionate idealist, who had helped form the two opposing aspects of his personality into one. The side which was seemingly chaotic, imaginative, inventive, and revolutionary had fought endlessly with one of order, familiarity, routine, simplicity, and civility. One cannot exist without the other, as Mr. Tiberias himself had stated, taking insight from the Gnostic mystics and their incorporation of both good and evil equally into the spectrum of human morality. They both needed each other, that was for certain. But now Mr. Tiberias was gone, vanished into an unknown void of what he claimed to be a promising afterlife, but nothing could be certain. What was to be said of his disappearance? Was it that he had simply become too full of pride and overstepped his bounds, thus necessitating punitive actions by the powers that be? Or was Mr. Tiberias perhaps more complicated than that, one whose motives lay outside epistemological bounds and thus doomed to remain forever unknowable? Was it something so numinous even that someone with an apprehensive description of the background of Mr. Tiberias would fail to find it? It was these very traits that were synonymous with his vision of unified, collective souls untethered from the ego. Was he lying? It was difficult to tell. Mr. Tiberias's methods lay far outside any attempted moral, ethical, or even logical system, appearing more as an irreconcilable medley of ideas that perhaps became too much of a portfolio of showing-off intellectual real estate to handle, and he had to dispense with it in order for him to be accepted into that higher realm of existence. He may not have died, but simply migrated into a different vessel, perhaps through reincarnation or metempsychosis, going on to attain a better position in a different reality, maybe egotistical and more upfront and honest. Even I, the narrator of this book, cannot say for certain. Metaphysics is a very addling science, offering no certainties, so we may never know for certain who or what Mr. Tiberias was. A dream, a phantom, a demon, simply an old fool who carried over by the dregs of a previous lifetime. This may sound like a flippant alibi, but it is the best we've got. Even the most applied and rational of the sciences concede that there is a margin of the doubt and subjectivity. Those elusive and inescapable limitations of society, of reality, are here to stay. Nevertheless, it appeared that these abnormal experiences did yield some effective changes. No longer did Cameron look in the mirror and see an unrecognizable, ghastly figure. He was not at odds with himself anymore. Both contrasting sides of his personality were equally attuned with one another. While he didn't feel perfect, he was truthfully better off. The dread of work and professional life was gone, and his mind was not burdened with limitless rumination. He was free to be who he was, an everyman, and now he could live his life free of culpability and a looming guilt. This wasn't to say that he would be perfectly well off by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, he still had things he had to amend. However, he would feel a vigorous newfound confidence. It was not that he had everything he wanted, but that he knew how to limit the horizons of his needs and desires. There was no inner burning kernel of passion or lust in him that constantly needed to be validated. It was this confidence that he returned to his typical routine at first, but quickly began to make minor changes and started to switch jobs. And to something like Cameron, who just weeks earlier had been living a dreary life, these changes were very much welcome.